to Patricia Gundry, because Gundry had been invited to speak at a local meeting of the housewives for the ERA. So housewives actually thought the ERA was a good thing. And that organization had been founded by a Methodist minister's wife. Anyway, it's really interesting. Word got out that Gundry's husband taught at Moody Bible Institute. And then the ERA opponents, local ones, swung into action. They started pressuring Moody Bible Institute like nothing before, and in response to this pressure, Moody ended up banning Patricia Gundry from campus, and they forced her husband to resign. He lost his job. Now, they justified this decision by appealing to evangelical tradition. They said that throughout its history, the school had held a, quote, consistent position opposing women's ordination. In response to his firing, another woman by the name of Janet Hassey decided to write a book of her own. It was called No Time for Silence. Now, she had been a student of Stan Gundry's, and she did some historical research in the Moody Bible Institute archives and discovered that in its first 40 years of existence, the Moody Bible Institute had trained dozens of women preachers and had publicized their ministries. Again, going back to the 1920s, this is the era of the International Association of Women Ministers, right? She put together a collection of all sorts of wonderful female preachers from evidence gathered from Moody's own publications. And she demonstrated that around the turn of the century, evangelicals, especially again those identified with the holiness or Pentecostal movements, had allowed and even encouraged women to take on significant public ministry roles. Now, I'll note that in my own research, I actually came across a review of Catherine Bushnell's Radical Feminist Theology in the Moody Monthly in the 1920s, and much to my surprise at the time, it was a positive review. As the century progressed, however, women in these movements were gradually squeezed out of the leadership roles by men. Very, very quickly, their stories were lost, sometimes intentionally buried. And a new narrative took hold. Evangelical churches had always banned women from leadership positions. It was biblical. It was traditional, God ordained, true from the beginning of time, except it wasn't. So the reason that Pat Gundry and other evangelical feminists faced so much opposition in the 1970s is not simply due to a timeless evangelical theology or to biblical literalism. But in the 1970s, evangelicals were not just coalescing as a religious movement, they were also coming together as a cultural and a political movement. And gender was at the heart of this identity. So men like Bill Gothard, I won't ask who's heard of Bill Gothard, James Dobson, I know you've all heard of James Dobson, Tim LaHaye, Jerry Falwell Sr., and women like Beverly LaHaye, Maribel Morgan, Elizabeth Elliot were placing gender difference at the heart of the gospel. So that to be an evangelical, to be properly Christian, was to embrace a patriarchy that I argue is as much cultural as biblical, or frankly much more so. And this patriarchy was linked to race and also to American nationalism in the 1970s, and we are living with that today. Sexuality, too, was at the heart of this movement. A renewed emphasis on sexual purity emerged at this time. But unlike Bushnell's social purity movement, there was nothing feminist about this sexual purity movement, as you probably well know. Whereas social purity activists like Bushnell had worked against the sexual double standard and couched their work in the framework of women's equality and empowerment, the later 20th century purity movement operated within a patriarchal framework and ended up reinforcing the sexual double standard. We're seeing right now today how this has produced at times very toxic results in churches, families, and religious communities. Now, it's at this time, too, in the 1970s, that the Southern Baptist Convention undergoes a dramatic transformation. it was long home to a diverse range of views on gender and authority, on women's leadership. It was home to many female religious leaders, including a number of pastors. But in the 1970s, as some conservatives in the denomination started to get alarmed at a growing number of female pastors in the SBC and at the spread of this evangelical feminism within the denomination, they conspired, and yes, it was conspiratorial, they conspired to take back their denomination, and they succeeded. They were motivated not just by the cultural changes that they saw taking place, but again, by the vibrancy of evangelical feminism in their own communities. They set out to quash progressive voices, and again, they accomplished their goal. It's hard to acknowledge or to recognize today that the SBC was not just home to the likes of Al Mohler, but also Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and Jimmy Carter, right? Again, this is a very recent, speaking of history, a recent transformation. Now, these conservative forces didn't just take over the SBC, but to a large extent, they have taken over much of white evangelicalism in the United States, which brings us to today. Today, you'll still find a diversity within evangelicalism in the United States and globally. This gets really interesting as well. You'll have a Willow Creek Church that affirms women at all levels of leadership. It used to be a much better example that I could throw out there until recently. We could talk about that too with Bill Hybels. You'll have a woman like Paula White in charismatic and prosperity churches. Until recently, we had Jen Hatmaker and Rachel Held Evans who identified as evangelicals. But here too, we see conservatives forcing or defining them outside of the boundaries that they continue to draw. Despite how people sometimes talk about it, evangelicalism is not a static faith, right? It's incredibly dynamic, fluid, contested, and gender, the roles of women and men, and sexuality are at the heart of this contestation. But you probably all know this, right? Because this is the world in which we move today. And we are all working to navigate this contested tradition. One in which we have an inspiring history of female leadership, but also a history of entrenched opposition. And progressive and conservative forces continue to compete to define the evangelical tradition, to decide who is inside and who is outside the fold. And it's not always clear who has the upper hand. So, how can history help us navigate this current moment, these contentious times? First off, Christian feminism is not an oxymoron. Christian women should absolutely look to the past for inspiration, to the Grimke sisters, to Jarena Lee, to Mariah Stewart, to Sojourner Truth, Frances Willard, Kate Bushnell, Henrietta Mears, Pat Gundry, Letha Scanzoni, and maybe even to the axe-wielding Carrie Nation. Part of this history is understanding the conservative backlash, both in the 1920s with fundamentalism and again in the 1970s. But again, it's more complicated than just a story of backlash. For Christians today, I think the challenge remains to pursue a biblically grounded model of liberation for women. A liberation that ultimately comes through Christ. And this involves crafting a sexual ethic that both protects and empowers women, one rooted in biblical truth and in the freedom that Christ brings. And I think that's really where we are in this cultural, historical, theological moment. And it's a challenge before us today. Finally, last lesson. Let's see. There. Perhaps the greatest lesson that history teaches us is that things haven't always been this way. Christianity has changed dramatically in the last 150 years. American Christianity. Feminism has changed dramatically over that same stretch of time. Sexuality and sexual morality has changed dramatically. Purity has changed. So has the economy, scientific knowledge, politics, and all sorts of other things that provide a context in which Christians strive to be faithful followers of Christ. So I will leave you with the caution to be very suspicious of anyone who claims that anything is quote unquote traditional, by which they mean unchanging. Yet at the same time, we are called in this time and place to follow Christ and to share the teachings of the gospel. And we do have a wealth of resources on which to draw from those who have come before us. Thank you. So at this point, we have a little discussion, right, for half an hour? Okay, so at this point, what I would like you to do is return to either the groups you had, or if you want to mix things up, especially, and maybe meet somebody that you didn't drive out here with, move around, use the restroom. But what I hope is that we can, for a time in groups, and then again, we'll pull it out. I'll give you more time this time, I promise. And we'll have about a half an hour total, so maybe 10-15 minutes in groups, and then 10-15 minutes as a whole. Just to respond to this historical narrative. Was anything particularly surprising to you? Was anything particularly important, or just kind of curious to you? And at this point too, feel free to weave in your personal experiences, right? Because much of this has probably, or at least part of this, overlapped with your own lifetime. And certainly with the lifetime of your parents and grandparents. So let's take some time now to get together into groups and reflect on this. And again, I'll jump around and then we'll have a larger discussion. And at that point too, feel free to ask me questions. And then after that, I'll turn things over to Lynn. Okay, so find some groups again. So what are your thoughts? What was particularly surprising for you? What really grabbed your attention? What is helping you maybe rethink some things or understand some things at a deeper level? Yes?
I just thought about how fragile history is.
Yeah.
And if we don't have people like you doing the hard work of letting us know that there was a history in the movie Bible Institute of treating women.
Yeah.
Because without that history, then you can just say it's always been this way.
Yeah.
Until somebody says it's always been this way.
Exactly.
In all aspects of our history, what are the histories that we believe that were just handed down to us?
Yeah.
Maybe we truly don't know what it is.
Yeah, and as I was chatting with the group in the back, I mean, how quickly history is lost, right? You know, like we're talking just a few decades and boom, totally wiped away. And so, yeah, if we don't actually preserve that history, if we don't work to recover that history, it is very precarious. And it's very powerful to just be able to say, again, things haven't always been this way. As soon as you kind of diffuse the power of tradition, especially in Christian communities, because we tend to equate tradition with God ordained for all time, right? As soon as you can diffuse that, it doesn't tell you what you should do, right? That's where like my limits as a historian, whenever I've asked in interviews, so what should we do going forward? Like, I don't know. I can only tell you what we have done and what hasn't worked, and what everybody else has done has been wrong, but it can give us space to start coming together, and the freedom to go to the scriptures and to do so historically informed and theologically informed, and to look forward in a much more productive way, I think. Yeah. Other thoughts? Surprising, interesting, or just questions? Anybody from over here?
I was really ignorant to the history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so many of these women, I have to say, are incredibly inspiring, right? And one of the lessons, when I just kind of speak on women's rights more generally, one of the lessons I really emphasize, but it's absolutely true for Christian women, maybe even more so, is just how much courage it took to change history, right? How much courage it took to achieve women's suffrage. How much courage it took pioneering women ministers, and how long it took to bring about change, right? The women's suffrage movement, if you date its beginning, and you could go earlier, you could go to the 1830s when the Grimke sisters are writing, but if you just go Seneca Falls, 1848, my students are blown away that it's 70 years, more than 70 years to the 19th Amendment. Right? So you gotta pull up your sleeves and get ready to be in for the long haul, and not to be easily discouraged if you're working for social